The great hall of the Imperial Palace shook with the sound of celebration, as thousands of Valori nobles raised their crystal goblets toward the golden throne where Emperor Zorthal sat with pride burning in his fore. Ice-crowned Prince Kithrin stood at the center of the hall, his silver armor gleaming under the light of 100 floating orbs, and he raised his sword high above his head as the crowd roared his name again and again. "Today, we celebrate the greatest victory in our history," the prince shouted, his voice carrying across the massive chamber through ancient amplification crystals embedded in the walls. The Valori people had ruled their corner of the galaxy for over 4,000 years, spreading across 40 star systems with an iron grip that no species had ever challenged successfully. And they believed themselves to be the supreme rulers of all they surveyed 3 weeks ago. Their long-range sensors had detected strange vessels entering Dominion space near the frontier world of Thesser 4. And the Imperial Armada had been dispatched immediately to deal with this intrusion. Prince Kithrin had led the fleet personally, eager to prove himself worthy of the throne he would one day inherit. And he had commanded 300 of the finest warships in the entire Dominion. "These invaders came into our territory without permission," the prince continued, pacing across the polished floor as holographic images of the battle appeared in the air around him. "And we showed them the price of such arrogance." The crowd cheered again as the images show Valori warships unleashing torrents of plasma fire upon the strange alien vessels. There had been only 12 of them, these unknown craft with their angular designs and strange markings. But they had fought with a ferocity that still haunted the dreams of those who had survived the encounter. The aliens had tried to retreat at first, broadcasting signals that the Valori communication officers had ignored, assuming them to be tricks or traps designed to lower their guard when the first plasma bolts struck their hulls. The alien vessels had transformed from fleeing prey into something else entirely. They had turned and fought back with weapons that should not have existed on ships so small, railguns that fired projectiles at speeds the Valori had never seen before, missiles that seemed to think for themselves and chase their targets through impossible maneuvers. The battle had lasted 6 hours, and by the end, every single alien vessel had been reduced to burning wreckage floating in the void of space. But the victory had come at a terrible cost that Prince Kithrin was careful to minimize in his triumphant speech. 67 Valori warships had been destroyed, including 2 massive dreadnoughts that had been the pride of the Imperial Navy, and over 15,000 Valori soldiers had perished in the fighting. The prince spoke of sacrifice and honor, of brave warriors who had given their lives to protect the Dominion from these dangerous invaders. And the crowd wept tears of pride, even as they celebrated the ultimate victory. What the prince did not mention was the boarding actions that had occurred during the battle. When Valori soldiers had attempted to capture one of the alien vessels intact for study, those soldiers had encountered something that defied all their expectations of what living creatures should be capable of doing. The aliens were soft-skinned bipeds, smaller than the average Valori warrior, with only 2 eyes and no natural armor or weapons built into their bodies. And the initial reports had suggested they would be easy to subdue instead. The boarding parties had been slaughtered almost to the last soldier. The aliens had fought with primitive projectile weapons that somehow punched through Valori combat armor as if it were made of paper. And when their weapons ran empty, they had fought with blades and bare hands. One alien, according to a dying soldier's final transmission, had continued fighting even after losing an arm, using its remaining hand to crush the throat of a Valori warrior before finally succumbing to its wounds. Only a handful of aliens had been captured alive, all of them too badly wounded to continue fighting, and they now sat in containment cells deep beneath the Imperial Palace awaiting interrogation. Emperor Zorthal rose from his throne as his son finished speaking, and the entire hall fell silent in an instant as the ancient ruler spread his 4 arms wide in a gesture of blessing. "My son has proven himself a true warrior of the Valori," the emperor declared, his voice deep and resonant with the authority of 3 centuries of rule. "Let this victory be remembered for all time as the day we crushed a new enemy and proved once again that the Dominion cannot be challenged." The celebration continued long into the night, with feasting and dancing and songs of glory that would echo through the palace halls for days to come. But far below the revelry, in the cold stone chambers of the Imperial Intelligence Division, a very different scene was unfolding. Archon Salith, the oldest and most experienced intelligence officer in the entire Dominion, sat alone in her chamber, surrounded by glowing screens that displayed the recovered data from the destroyed alien vessels. Her team had spent 3 weeks working to crack the encryption on the alien computers, and they had finally succeeded just hours before the celebration began. What she had found made her blood run cold in her veins. The translation algorithms had worked faster than expected, perhaps because the alien language, while strange, followed logical patterns that the computers could analyze and decode with relative ease. She had learned that these creatures called themselves humans, and that they came from a world called Earth, in a star system far beyond Valori space. But it was not their name or their origin that had stolen the breath from her lungs and left her sitting in stunned silence. For over an hour it was a single phrase, stamped on every piece of equipment, every uniform, every data file, a designation that appeared again and again like a curse waiting to be understood. UNSC, Forward Reconnaissance Division, 3rd Scout Battalion. Salith had checked the translation 17 times, using different algorithms and different reference points, hoping desperately that she had made some kind of mistake. But the translation was accurate, and its meaning was clear. Scout Battalion, the 12 vessels that had cost them 67 warships and 2 dreadnoughts and 15,000 soldiers to destroy, had not been warships at all. They had not been an invasion force or a strike team or anything resembling a military threat. They had been scouts, observers, the equivalent of the small unarmed vessels the Valori sent ahead of their fleets to map unknown territory and observe potential enemies from a safe distance. And if these were the scouts, Salith realized with growing horror, then what did their actual warships look like? She reached for her communication device with trembling hands, knowing that she had to warn the Emperor immediately, knowing that the celebration happening above her head was not a victory at all. It was the beginning of something terrible, something the Valori had never faced in all their 4,000 years of dominance. And somewhere in the darkness of space, she was certain the humans were already coming. Archon Salith burst through the doors of the Royal Council chamber with a force that would have gotten any lesser official executed on the spot. But her rank and her wild expression gave the guards pause long enough for her to reach the inner sanctum. The celebration had ended only hours ago, and the Emperor and his advisors had gathered to discuss the political benefits of their great victory, never suspecting that their world was about to collapse around them. "Your Imperial Majesty, you must listen to me," Salith shouted, ignoring all protocol and tradition, as she rushed toward the throne with data tablets. Clutched in her trembling hands, Emperor Zorthel raised one of his 4 hands to stop the guards who had followed her into the chamber, his ancient eyes narrowing as he studied the intelligence officer he had known for over a century. "Archon Salith, you forget yourself," the Emperor said calmly, though there was an edge of warning in his voice. "What could possibly justify this intrusion?" "We did not win a battle, Your Majesty," Salith gasped, falling to her knees before the throne as she held up the data tablets for all to see. "We committed an act of war against a species that could destroy us without effort." Crown Prince Kithrin laughed from his position at his father's right hand. his golden eyes gleaming with amusement and contempt. "The old scholar has lost her mind," he said with a dismissive wave of his armored hand. "Perhaps the strain of the translation work has broken her thoughts." But Emperor Zorthel had not survived 3 centuries of rule by ignoring his most trusted advisors. And he gestured for Saleth to continue speaking. She activated the data tablets and projected the information into the air above her head, showing the council the recovered files from the human vessels. "These markings appear on every piece of equipment we recovered," she explained, pointing to the strange angular symbols that the translation algorithms had decoded. They identified the vessels and their crews as belonging to something called the UNSC Forward Reconnaissance Division, specifically the 3rd Scout Battalion, Scout. One of the council members repeated, his voice carrying a hint of confusion. "Yes, Scout." Saleth confirmed, her voice rising with desperate urgency. "These were not warships we fought against, my lords and ladies. These were reconnaissance vessels, the equivalent of our own mapping ships that carry no weapons and are crewed by scientists rather than soldiers." Prince Kithrin's laughter died in his throat as the implications of her words began to penetrate his arrogance. "That cannot be correct," he said, shaking his head in denial. "Those vessels destroyed 67 of our warships. They fought like demons from the darkest legends. And they were only scouts." Saleth replied, rising to her feet as her fear gave way to a frantic need to make them understand. "The translation is accurate. I have checked it dozens of times. Their mission was not combat. It was cartography. They were mapping our territory, observing our worlds, and we attacked them without provocation." The council chamber fell silent as the weight of her words settled over the assembled nobles like a funeral shroud. If the scout vessels had been that powerful, that deadly, that difficult to destroy, then what kind of monsters would their actual military ships be? "You are mistaken," Prince Kithrin insisted, though his voice had lost its confident edge. "No species would send mere scouts in vessels capable of such destruction. It must be a translation error." Before Saleth could respond, a young officer came running into the chamber with panic written across his face, and he threw himself to the floor before the throne without any of the usual formalities. "Your Majesty," he cried out, his voice cracking with terror, "the long-range sensors have detected something at the edge of Dominion space. An energy signature larger than anything we have ever recorded." Emperor Zorthel rose from his throne for the first time in years, his ancient joints creaking as he stepped forward with dread building in his heart. "Show me," he commanded. The young officer activated his portable display unit, and a holographic image of the sensor data appeared in the center of the chamber. At first, it looked like a cloud of static, a massive signal so dense that the sensors could barely process them individually, and it was growing larger with every passing moment. "How many vessels?" the Emperor asked quietly. "We cannot determine an exact count, Your Majesty," the officer replied with a trembling voice. "The signals are too numerous and too powerful for our sensors to separate them clearly. But our best estimate suggests at least 4,000 ships. Possibly more. 4,000 ships. The Valori Dominion's entire military fleet numbered only 2,000 vessels. And they had just lost 67 of those against 12 human scouts." Prince Kithrin stumbled backward, his silver armor suddenly feeling less like protection and more like a coffin waiting to close around him. "We must prepare our defenses," he said weakly. "We must call back all our fleets and fortify our core worlds." "That will take weeks," one of the admirals pointed out grimly. "And if these humans are as fast as their scouts, they will be upon us long before we can organize a proper defense." As they argued, the sensor display updated again, and the council watched in horrified silence as the cloud of signals began to resolve into individual contacts. The human fleet was enormous beyond anything the Valori had ever imagined possible. with vessels of every size and configuration spreading across the void like a swarm of angry insects. And at their center was something that defied belief. It was a ship the size of a small moon, bristling with weapon platforms and sensor arrays and docking bays that could swallow a Valori dreadnought whole. And it moved through space with a terrible grace that spoke of technology far beyond anything the Dominion possessed. Then the communication array crackled to life, and a voice spoke in perfect Valori, translated by computers, that made the ancient translation crystals of the palace seem like children's toys. "This is Admiral Helena Vance of the United Nations Space Command," the voice said calmly, without anger or threat, just cold professional certainty. "You have destroyed UNSC Survey Vessel Group 7 and killed over 300 of our people, including civilians and scientists who were operating under peaceful exploration protocols." The voice paused, and in that silence, every member of the council felt their hearts stop beating. "You have 60 standard hours to surrender those responsible for this attack and submit them for trial under human military law," Admiral Vance continued. "Failure to comply will be interpreted as confirmation that your entire government has chosen war with the United Nations Space Command, and we will respond accordingly." Another pause, longer this time, heavy with unspoken threat. "There will not be a second warning." The transmission ended, and Emperor Zorthal sank back onto his throne as the weight of 4,000 years of Valori dominance crumbled to dust around him. They had poked something in the darkness of space, something ancient and terrible and far more powerful than they could have ever imagined. And now that something was coming for them, and there was absolutely nothing they could do to stop it. The royal shuttle crossed the void between the Valori defensive line and the human fleet with a slowness that felt like torture to everyone. Aboard, Crown Prince Kithrin stood at the forward viewport, watching the human vessels grow larger and larger until they filled his entire field of vision. And for the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to be truly small. His father had ordered him to lead this diplomatic mission personally. A decision that Kithrin now suspected was less about honor and more about removing a potential threat to the throne should things go badly. If the humans killed him, the Emperor would lose an arrogant son who had brought disaster upon the Dominion. And if they let him live, perhaps he could negotiate a peace that would save their civilization from destruction. Either way, Emperor Zorthal would survive. And that was all that mattered to the ancient ruler. The shuttle was escorted by human fighter craft that moved with an agility the Valori pilots could only dream of achieving, dancing around the larger vessel like predators herding prey toward a trap. When they finally docked with the massive human flagship, the ISS Thermopylae, Kithrin felt the vibration of magnetic clamps seizing his shuttle with enough force to crush the hull if the humans decided they wanted him dead. The airlock opened with a hiss of pressure equalization, and Kithrin stepped through with his diplomatic team following close behind. Their faces pale with barely concealed terror, a squad of human soldiers waited for them on the other side, standing in perfect formation with weapons held at the ready. And Kithrin's first thought was how small they looked. These creatures barely reached his chest in height, and their soft pink skin seemed vulnerable compared to the armored scales that protected his own body. And he might have felt a moment of hope if not for their eyes. Their eyes were the eyes of predators, cold and calculating and utterly without mercy. And they tracked every movement the Valori made with the focused intensity of hunters who had already decided their prey was not worthy of fear. "Follow me," one of the soldiers said, his voice flat and emotionless. "Admiral Vance is waiting." They walked through corridors that seemed to stretch on forever, past hundreds of soldiers who stood at attention as they passed. And Kithrin began to understand just how badly he had underestimated these creatures. Every soldier they passed radiated lethal capability, from the smallest human to the largest, and their equipment was clearly designed with a single purpose in mind: killing as efficiently as possible. These were not scouts or scientists or explorers. These were Marines, the humans' warrior caste, and they had been bred for war in ways the Valori could barely comprehend. Admiral Helena Vance received them in a briefing room that was sparse and functional, with none of the decorations or displays of wealth that would have filled a similar room in the Imperial Palace. She was old by human standards, with gray hair cut short and a face lined with decades of experience. And she looked fragile enough that Kithrin could have broken her in half with his bare hands. But when she looked at him, he felt like a small animal caught in the gaze of something ancient and terrible, and he had to fight the urge to drop to his knees and beg for mercy. "Sit," she said, gesturing to chairs that were clearly not designed for Valori bodies. "We have much to discuss." Kithrin and his team struggled to fit themselves into the small seats, their dignity crumbling further with every awkward movement. And Admiral Vance watched them without expression when they were finally seated. She activated a holographic display that showed recordings of the battle near Thesser 4, and Kithran watched with growing horror as the events played out. From the human perspective, he saw the human vessels trying to retreat, broadcasting signals of peace and non-aggression that the Valori had ignored or dismissed as tricks. Saw the first plasma bolts striking human hulls, killing people who had been preparing to send friendly greetings rather than weapons fire. He saw human crews dying at their stations, scientists and cartographers and geologists who had come to explore and discover rather than fight. And he saw the survivors scrambling to defend themselves against an enemy that attacked without warning or reason. Those were not soldiers, Admiral Vance said quietly when the recording ended. Those were scientists, researchers, explorers who volunteered for dangerous assignments because they believed in the value of knowledge and the hope of peaceful contact with new species. She paused, and her eyes met Kithrin's with an intensity that made him want to look away. "They have families, Prince Kithrin, wives and husbands and children who will never see them again, because your people decided that shoot first and ask questions later was an acceptable diplomatic policy." Kithrin gathered what remained of his courage and attempted to respond from a position of strength, hoping that perhaps he could negotiate better terms if the humans believed the Valori were still dangerous. "The Dominion has ruled this region of space for 4,000 years, he said, keeping his voice as steady as he could manage. "Our military is powerful enough to make any conflict costly for your people. And perhaps we could—" Admiral Vance raised one hand, and the holographic display changed to show a comparison of their respective military forces. The Valori Dominion's entire fleet, approximately 2,000 warships, the human response force currently in Valori space, 4,300 vessels, total UNSC naval strength across all human territories, over 90,000 combat-rated ships. Kithrin felt his arguments die in his throat as he stared at the numbers. And beside him, one of his diplomatic aides made a sound that might have been a whimper or might have been a prayer. "You are not negotiating from strength, Prince Kithrin," Admiral Vance said. And for the first time, there was something almost like pity in her voice. "You are being shown mercy, and I suggest you accept it with gratitude rather than threats." She leaned forward, her small human hands folded on the table in front of her. And Kithron realized that those hands had probably signed orders that killed more beings than the entire population of his homeworld. "We do not want to destroy you," she continued. "We have seen enough death and suffering in our own history to know that genocide is never a solution, only a postponement of problems that will eventually return to haunt the survivors." "Then what do you want?" Kithrin asked, and he hated how weak his voice sounded. "Justice," Admiral Vance replied simply. "Those who gave the order to attack our people must face trial for their crimes, and the Valori Dominion must accept certain conditions to ensure that this never happens again." She slid a data tablet across the table toward him, and Kithran picked it up with trembling hands. The terms were harsh, but not impossible. Surrender of those responsible for the attack, payment of reparations to the families of the dead, acceptance of human oversight of Valori military operations, and integration into the United Nations Space Command as a protectorate rather than a conquered territory. It was, Kithran realized slowly, the most generous surrender document he had ever seen, and that terrified him more than anything else, because it meant the humans were not acting out of anger or revenge. They were acting out of something far more dangerous, cold, calculated, unshakable certainty that they were in the right, and there was nothing the Valori could do except accept their judgment and pray that human mercy was as genuine as it appeared. While Prince Kithran negotiated aboard the human flagship, Archon Salith had been granted a privilege that no Valori had ever received before. Access to the human historical database. It was a gesture of good faith from Admiral Vance, intended to help the Valori understand the species they had attacked and perhaps convince them that cooperation was their only viable path forward. Salith had accepted eagerly, hoping to find some weakness in these terrifying creatures that might give her people leverage in the negotiations, some flaw or vulnerability that could be exploited. If the peace talks failed, what she found instead shattered everything she had ever believed about the nature of intelligent life and the possibility of peaceful coexistence in the universe. The humans had achieved faster than light travel only 300 years ago, a fact that made Salith's blood run cold when she compared it to Valori history. Her people had possessed FTL technology for over 4,000 years, and in that time they had expanded to just 40 star systems, carefully consolidating their power and building their empire one world at a time. Humans had spread to over 200 worlds in a tenth of the time, breeding and building and expanding with a speed that defied all logic and reason. And they showed no signs of slowing down, but it was human history before space travel that truly horrified her. The long, bloody chronicle of a species that seemed designed for nothing but violence and death. These creatures had spent their entire existence at war, not just with the predators and environmental hazards of their homeworld, but with each other. They had fought wars that killed millions of their own kind over territory, over resources, over religion, over ideas, over nothing more than the color of their skin or the place of their birth. They had invented weapons capable of destroying their entire planet. Nuclear bombs that could level cities in an instant and leave the land poisoned for generations. And they had built thousands of these weapons before they ever left their solar system. And the most terrifying part was that these weapons had actually worked to prevent war. The humans had developed something called nuclear deterrence, the idea that if everyone had enough weapons to destroy everything, then no one would dare to start a fight because everyone would lose. It was insane. It was suicidal. It was completely beyond anything the Valori had ever imagined. And somehow it had worked. The humans had balanced on the edge of total annihilation for decades, pointing their world-ending weapons at each other and daring their enemies to make the first move. And they had survived. They had survived. And then they had reached for the star. Salith moved on to human biology, hoping to find something more comforting. And instead, she found even more reasons to despair. The human homeworld was classified by galactic standards as a death world, a planet so hostile to life that its mere existence seemed like a mistake of cosmic proportions, gravity strong enough to crush most species, an atmosphere filled with corrosive oxygen, massive temperature variations between day and night and between seasons, water that fell from the sky in liquid and solid forms, and an ecosystem filled with predators that had evolved alongside humans for millions of years. And the humans had not merely survived on this nightmare world. They had conquered it. They had spread across every continent, from frozen wastelands where the air itself could kill in minutes to scorching deserts where water was scarcer than gold. They had climbed mountains so tall that the air at the summit could not sustain life. And they had done this for recreation, for fun. Because the challenge amused them, they had swum across frozen oceans, had walked across continents on foot, had survived wounds that would kill any Valori 10 times over. Their bodies could heal from injuries that should be permanent, regrowing tissue and sealing wounds with a speed that bordered on the miraculous. They could function without sleep for days at a time, when necessary, operating on nothing but willpower and stimulants until their mission was complete. They could lose limbs and continue fighting, could suffer pain that would send a Valori into shock and keep pushing forward through sheer determination and the scouts that the Valori had killed. They were considered the cautious ones, the ones humanity sent ahead specifically to ensure that first contact went peacefully. They were the scientists, the diplomats, the bridge builders who volunteered to go into the unknown because they believed in the possibility of friendship between species, the actual warriors, the Marines and soldiers and Special Forces operatives who made up the human military, were bred for violence in ways the Valori could barely comprehend. Zilith found records of something called Special Operations Training, a process designed to push humans beyond their normal limits and create soldiers capable of operating in any environment. Against any enemy, the training alone killed a significant percentage of those who attempted it, and the survivors were considered merely adequate for the basic requirements of their job. She found records of human wars, battles where soldiers had charged directly into enemy fire, knowing they would die, sacrificing themselves to achieve objectives that would benefit their comrades or their nation. She found records of something called berserker rage, a mental state where humans became so consumed by combat that they ignored wounds that should have killed them and continued fighting until every enemy was dead or they themselves collapsed. She found records of human parents telling their children stories about monsters, creatures that lived under beds and in closets and came out at night to hunt. The unwary humans grew up expecting to fight nightmares, learning from infancy that the darkness held things that wanted to hurt them. And they faced this knowledge not with paralyzing fear, but with determination to be stronger than whatever might be lurking in the shadows. The Valori had attacked a species that considered fear itself a childhood game, a challenge to be overcome rather than a warning to be heeded. Sylith closed the database with trembling hands and sat in silence for a long time, staring at the wall of her quarters without seeing anything. She understood now why the humans had offered such generous surrender terms, why they had chosen mercy over destruction despite having every reason and every capability to wipe the Valori from existence. Was not weakness or naivety or the softness of a species that had never faced real challenges. It was the supreme confidence of predators who knew exactly how dangerous they were and had decided, as a conscious choice, to be something better. The humans could have destroyed them without breaking a sweat, could have reduced every Valori world to ash and salt and moved on without looking back. Instead, they had chosen to offer peace, to extend a hand in friendship to enemies who had murdered their scientists and explorers without provocation. And that choice, Salith realized, was more terrifying than any weapon or fleet or army could ever be, because it meant the humans were not just powerful, they were civilized, and civilization, in being so capable of destruction, was the most frightening thing she had ever encountered. Emperor Zorthel signed the surrender documents in the Great Hall of the Imperial Palace, the same room where he had celebrated what he believed to be his people's greatest victory only weeks before. The irony was not lost on him. and he felt the weight of 4,000 years of Valori dominance crumbling to dust with every stroke of his ceremonial. Pan-human officials stood in a row before the throne, their small forms somehow more intimidating than any army that had ever marched through these ancient halls. And they watched the proceedings with expressions that revealed nothing of their thoughts. Admiral Helena Vance stood at their center, her gray eyes fixed on the Emperor with a gaze that seemed to see through all his pretensions and excuses to the frightened old man underneath when the last signature was complete. She stepped forward and took the documents with a face nod that might have been respect or might have been simple acknowledgement of a transaction concluded. The United Nations Space Command accepts your surrender, she said, her voice carrying across the silent hall. From this day forward, the Valori Dominion is a protectorate of the UNSC, subject to our laws and our oversight. But not our conquest. There was a murmur from the assembled nobles, confusion mixing with relief as they struggled to understand what that distinction meant. You will retain your government, your culture, your way of life, Admiral Vance continued. We have no interest in ruling you directly or forcing you to become something you are not. But we will ensure that you never again attack peaceful vessels without provocation. And we will hold those responsible for this incident accountable for their actions. The trials were swift but fair, conducted according to human legal principles that the Valori found strange but not incomprehensible. Those who had given the order to fire on the human scouts were sentenced to life imprisonment in human rehabilitation facilities, places designed not for punishment but for reform, where they would spend the rest of their days learning about the species they had wronged and the consequences of their choices. The Valori had expected execution, the traditional punishment for crimes against foreign powers, and they did not know how to react when the humans explained that they did not believe in killing as a form of justice. Death ends the possibility of change, the human judge had explained during the sentencing, and we believe that even the worst among us can learn to be better, given enough time and proper guidance. Crown Prince Kithrin received a different sentence, one that many of the Valori nobles considered worse than death. He was stripped of all his titles and honors, his silver armor taken away and replaced with simple work clothes, and he was assigned to serve alongside human aid organizations on the frontier worlds that his glorious victory had disrupted. He would spend years helping to rebuild what had been damaged, working side by side with humans and Valori alike, learning firsthand about the people he had helped to kill and the families he had destroyed when he protested that this was beneath his dignity. Admiral Vance had looked at him with something approaching compassion. Dignity is earned, Prince Kithrin, she had said, not inherited. And you have much earning to do in the months that followed. The true nature of human rule began to reveal itself, and the Valori discovered that they had not been conquered by tyrants, but by something far more unsettling. Human ambassadors arrived on every Valori world, not as governors or overseers, but as advisors and friends, bringing with them gifts that the Valori could never have imagined, medicines that cured diseases the Valori had suffered for millennia, treatments for conditions that have been considered death sentences for as long as anyone could remember, agricultural techniques that increase crop yields tenfold, ending food shortages on a dozen worlds and transforming barren regions into fertile farmland, educational programs that taught Valori children about the universe beyond their borders, about the hundreds of species that lived in peace under human protection, about the possibilities that awaited those who chose cooperation over conflict, and always, the humans emphasized that these gifts came with no strings attached, that they expected nothing in return except the simple promise that the Valori would never again attack without cause. It was Archon Salith realized as she watched her people slowly transform. The most terrifying thing of all, the humans had not come to destroy them or enslave them or exploit them for resources. They had come to help them, to lift them up, to make them part of something greater than any empire the Valori had ever imagined, and they had done this after the Valori had killed their scientists and explorers, after the Valori had attacked without warning or mercy, after the Valori had proven themselves to be the villains of this story in every possible way. In her final report to the historical archives, Salith sat alone in her chamber and composed the words that she hoped would help future generations understand what had happened and why we attacked what we believed to be a weak and primitive species. She wrote, her hands no longer trembling but steady with acceptance and understanding. We killed their scientists, their explorers, the ones they send ahead to ensure peace. And we celebrated our victory without ever stopping to consider what we had truly done. She paused, looking out the window at a sky that now seemed full of possibility rather than threat. And when their warriors came, beings forged in the fire of a death world and tempered by millennia of conflict against themselves and everything else, they chose not to destroy us, she continued. They chose to teach us, to help us, to show us that there is a better way to exist in this universe than the endless cycle of conquest and domination we had pursued for 4,000 years. She thought of Prince Kithrin, working in the fields of a frontier world, his arrogance slowly giving way to understanding as he learned what it meant to truly serve others. She thought of the human doctors who had saved her own life just weeks ago, curing a condition she had carried since childhood with a treatment so simple that Valori medicine had overlooked it for centuries. She thought of the children she saw in the streets, Valori and human playing together without fear or hatred, building a future that would be better than anything the Old Dominion had ever achieved. The humans have a saying, she wrote, finishing her report with words that she knew would echo through Valori history for generations to come. Speak softly and carry a big stick is how they described their approach to diplomacy. She smiled, an expression that had become more common on her face in recent months. We heard only silence before we saw their stick, and we were foolish enough to mistake that silence for weakness. She signed her name at the bottom of the document and added one final line. We are fortunate that they also carry bandages, and that their mercy is as great as their strength, because in the end, we did not deserve either, but we received both. The archive sealed her report and transmitted it to every world in the former Dominion. And Archon Salith walked out into the sunlight of a new day, ready to help build the future that the humans had made possible. It would not be easy, and it would not be quick, but for the first time in 4,000 years, the Valori had something they had never truly possessed before: hope.